You've seen the montage. Everybody has seen the montage. The person falls, the person gets back up. The music swells, the lighting shifts. The failure becomes the foundation, and the pain becomes the fuel, and the struggle becomes the story, and by the time the camera pulls back for the wide shot, the person is standing on the other side of everything that tried to break them, and they're better for it, stronger, wiser, transformed by the difficulty into someone who couldn't have existed without it. Fall, learn, rise. Repeat 4 words, 1 sentence. The entire trajectory of human resilience compressed into a bumper sticker that fits on a coffee mug. The montage is a lie, not a complete lie. The falling and the rising are real. People do fall and people do rise, and the human capacity for recovery after devastating loss is genuine and documented and worthy of respect. But the montage edits out the part that determines whether the person actually makes it to the rising, the part between the fall and the rise, the middle. The stretch of time after the collapse and before the recovery, where nothing is inspirational and nothing is cinematic, and nothing feels like a story that will one day be told from a stage with good lighting. The middle is the part they don't film. The middle is the 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling wondering if you've ruined everything. The middle is the crying in the shower because the shower is the only place left where the sound is covered and nobody asks what's wrong. The middle is the week where you couldn't get out of bed and told everyone you had the flu because the flu is an acceptable reason to disappear. And I'm falling apart, and I don't know how to stop it is not. The middle is the phone you didn't answer because the person calling would have asked how you're doing, and you would have had to choose between the lie that you're fine and the truth that you're not, and both options felt impossible, so you let it ring. The middle is the thing that happened after the fall and before the rise that nobody talks about because it doesn't fit the 4-word formula, and it doesn't look good on a poster, and it is the only part of the story that actually matters. Because the middle is where people break, not the fall. The fall is dramatic. The fall has its own energy. The fall, however devastating, has the quality of an event, a thing that happened, a before and after that the mind can process because it has clear edges. But the middle has no edges. The middle is the undifferentiated gray stretch of days after the event where the person has to somehow continue existing without the identity, the stability, the relationship, the income, the health, the plan, the whatever it was that the fall destroyed. The middle is where the crying happens, and the crying is the part nobody puts in the montage. This audiobook is about the middle, the part of the resilience narrative that the narrative skips over because the middle is too long, too messy, too unflattering, and too real for the format. 5 chapters. What the montage hides about recovery. Why the middle is where the actual work happens. What the crying is actually doing. Why the timeline is a lie. And how to survive the part between the fall and the rise when nobody is filming, and nobody is watching, and the only audience is you, and the ceiling at 3 a.m. 1 hour, no montage, no music swell, just the truth about what happens in between. Let's look at it honestly. Chapter 1. The Montage Lie. How the culture edits suffering into content. The resilience narrative has a format. The format was not designed to describe reality. It was designed to produce content. Content that inspires. Content that performs well on platforms that reward emotional arcs that resolve within the attention span of the audience. Content that makes the consumer feel something briefly before scrolling to the next piece of content that makes them feel something else briefly. The format has 3 beats: the fall, the pivot, the rise. 3 beats is the structure of every story the culture tells about difficulty, from the social media post to the memoir to the commencement speech to the documentary. Beat 1, everything falls apart. Beat 2, the person finds the lesson or the strength or the moment of clarity. Beat 3, the person rises, transformed, better, proof that the suffering was meaningful and the difficulty was the point. The format works because it's satisfying. It provides the emotional closure that the brain craves. The narrative tension of the fall is resolved by the rise, and the resolution produces the neurochemical reward that makes the consumer share the content, remember the content, and internalize the message that the content delivered. Fall, learn, rise, repeat. The formula is emotionally complete, psychologically resolved, narratively satisfying. And it bears almost no relationship to how recovery actually works. This is crucial. The 3-beat format edits out the middle because the middle doesn't fit the format. The middle is not a beat. It's a duration, a stretch of time that can last weeks, months, or years. The middle doesn't have a clear beginning or end. It doesn't build toward a climax. It doesn't resolve in a moment of clarity where the music changes and the lesson arrives. The middle is formless. It's the period where the person is no longer falling, but hasn't yet begun to rise, and the gap between those 2 states is filled with something that has no narrative arc, no turning point, no moment the camera can capture. The gap is filled with endurance, with the grinding, repetitive, cinematically worthless act of continuing to exist when the reason for existing is unclear, and the path to the rise is invisible, and the only thing the person can do is keep waking up and keep moving through the hours, and keep doing the minimum required to not descend further, while the recovery that will eventually come operates on a timeline that nobody can see and nobody can accelerate. Most people miss this about why the 3-beat format is so damaging to people who are actually in the middle. The format teaches the audience that the middle doesn't exist, that the fall leads directly to the lesson, which leads directly to the rise, that the pivot from suffering to recovery is a moment, not a duration. That somewhere between the fall and the rise there is a scene, a conversation, a realization, a single moment where everything shifts and the person begins their ascent. And the person who is in the middle, who is weeks or months into the gray stretch with no pivot in sight, compares their experience to the format and concludes that something is wrong with them, that they should have found the lesson by now, that the rise should have begun, that the fact that they're still crying, still unable to function at full capacity, still waking at 3 a.m., still feeling the weight of the fall as if it happened yesterday, means they're failing at the recovery the way the format says recovery works. The format doesn't just edit out the middle. It teaches people that the middle is a failure rather than a phase. And the belief that the middle is a failure rather than the necessary terrain between the fall and the rise makes the middle worse. It adds shame to the suffering, and shame added to suffering is the compound that breaks people. Chapter 2: Why the middle is where the actual work happens. the unglamorous truth. The montage shows the fall and the rise because the fall and the rise are events. Events are filmable. Events have visual drama. The building burns. The person stands in the ashes. The person later stands on the stage. 2 images, 2 events, a before and an after. The viewer's brain fills in the gap with the assumption that something happened in between, something heroic, something characterized by the same dramatic energy as the fall and the rise. Nothing heroic happens in the middle. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make a good scene. What happens in the middle is the slow, invisible, incremental accumulation of micro-recoveries that individually are too small to notice and collectively are the entire mechanism by which a human being rebuilds after being broken. The micro-recovery. A micro-recovery is a single moment where the person's capacity to function increases by an amount so small that it is invisible to the person experiencing it and invisible to everyone around them. The increment is so minor that it registers as nothing, as stagnation, as another day in the gray stretch that looks identical to every other day in the gray stretch. But the increment is real. And the accumulation of increments is the entire engine of recovery. The day you manage to cook a meal when the previous week you couldn't manage more than cereal eaten, standing in the kitchen with the lights off, because even sitting at the table felt like too much organization for a mind that could barely organize the next breath. The meal wasn't good. The meal was pasta with jar sauce and you ate half of it and put the rest in the fridge where it sat for 3 days before you threw it away. But the meal happened. The shopping happened. The standing at the stove and the boiling of water and the draining of pasta happened. And each of those micro-actions, each one requiring a decision, and an effort that the pre-fall version of you would have executed without thinking, was a micro-recovery. A data point in a trend that is invisible from inside the data, but that is real, and that is moving, and that is building toward the moment where cooking a meal is no longer an achievement, but is simply a meal again. The hour you spent focused on work when the previous month the focus lasted 15 minutes before the grief or the anxiety or the involuntary replay of the event pulled you back under. 15 minutes was your capacity. In 20, then 30, then an hour where the work occupied the foreground and the loss occupied the background rather than the other way around. The shift from foreground to background happened without announcement, without a pivot, without a scene. It happened because the brain's processing capacity was slowly, incrementally, microscopically being restored as the neurochemical storm of the acute phase gradually subsided, and the prefrontal cortex gradually resumed its function, and the attention system gradually reclaimed the bandwidth that the loss had commandeered. The evening you laughed at something, genuinely laughed, not the polite, performed social laugh that you'd been producing for weeks to signal normalcy. A real laugh, from the belly, at something stupid on television or something a friend said or something a child did. And the laugh surprised you. It surprised you because you'd forgotten what it felt like, and the forgetting had become so normal, so integrated into the gray landscape of the middle, that the sudden appearance of a genuine laugh was disorienting. Almost wrong, as if laughter was a language you used to speak and had forgotten, and the single word that came out unbidden felt foreign in your mouth. But the laugh happened, and the laugh was a micro-recovery, evidence that the emotional range which the loss had compressed into the narrow band between numb and devastated was beginning to expand again. Not dramatically, not all at once. One laugh, one moment of unexpected lightness in a landscape of gray. But the moment happened, and it could not unhappen, and the emotional range that produced it was slightly wider than it had been before. The morning you woke up and the first thought wasn't about the fall. It wasn't about the loss or the failure or the ending or the thing that happened that rearranged your life into a shape you didn't recognize. The first thought was about the coffee, about the need for caffeine, about the ordinary, mundane, profoundly boring desire for a hot beverage that had nothing to do with the catastrophe that had been your first thought every morning for weeks. And the coffee thought, so insignificant, so devoid of dramatic arc, so completely unworthy of a scene in any montage ever produced, was the most important thought you'd had since the fall. Because the coffee thought was evidence that the fall was loosening its grip on the first moment of consciousness, that the waking mind was beginning to reach for the day rather than being immediately pulled under by the loss, that the morning, the very first seconds of awareness, were being gradually reclaimed by the present rather than being owned entirely by the past. Each micro-recovery is trivial in isolation. No single one is the turning point. No single one is the moment the montage would film. No single one would be mentioned in the social media post or the TED Talk or the commencement speech. They're too small, too boring, too ordinary. But the accumulation of hundreds of micro-recoveries across weeks and months is the mechanism. The actual mechanism by which a broken person becomes an unbroken person, not the dramatic realization, not the inspirational pivot, not the moment the music swells and the lighting shifts. The mechanism is the cereal giving way to the cooked meal, giving way to the meal shared with another person, giving way to the meal, enjoyed rather than merely consumed. The mechanism is the 15 minutes of focus, becoming 30, becoming an hour, becoming a day, where work felt not just possible but engaging. The mechanism is the laugh becoming more frequent, and the 3 a.m. sealing sessions becoming less frequent, and the gap between the sealing sessions widening so gradually that the widening is only visible in retrospect. Looking back from the rise and realizing with something approaching wonder that the middle was working the entire time you were convinced it wasn't, that the nothing you were experiencing was actually everything you needed. This is crucial. The middle feels like nothing is happening because the unit of progress in the middle is too small for the human mind to detect in real time. The mind detects change through comparison. Large changes are detected immediately. Small changes accumulate below the threshold of detection until enough of them have accumulated to produce a noticeable shift. The middle is entirely composed of sub-threshold changes. Each day in the middle feels identical to the previous day. Each week feels identical to the previous week. The person in the middle, comparing today to yesterday, sees no change and concludes that recovery isn't happening, that they're stuck, that the middle is permanent, that the rise the montage promised is not coming. But if the person in the middle compared today to 30 days ago, the change would be visible. The capacity is slightly higher. The darkness is slightly less total. The weight is slightly more bearable. The change exists. It's real. It's measurable. But it's only visible at a scale the person in the middle can't access because the person in the middle is experiencing the recovery day by day, moment by moment, and the moment-by-moment experience of sub-threshold progress is indistinguishable from the experience of no progress at all. This is the cruelest feature of the middle. The recovery is happening, and the person recovering can't feel it happening. The improvement is real, and the improved person doesn't know they're improving. The rise has already begun, and the person rising doesn't know they're rising because the ascent is so gradual that it feels like standing still. Chapter 3. What the crying is actually doing. The biology behind the breakdown. The crying is not a failure. The culture treats it as one. The culture says be strong, get back up, push through, keep moving, don't dwell. The language of resilience is the language of action and forward motion and the absolute refusal to be still with the pain long enough for the pain to do what pain is designed to do. The culture is wrong about this. Not partially wrong, fundamentally wrong. The crying is not the obstacle between the fall and the rise. The crying is the mechanism. The neurochemistry of emotional processing. When a significant loss or trauma occurs, the brain's threat detection system activates a cascade of neurochemical responses designed to protect the organism from the immediate danger. Cortisol floods the system. The sympathetic nervous system shifts into high activation. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, perspective, meaning-making, and the integration of the experience into the broader narrative of a life, goes partially offline because the brain is allocating resources to survival rather than understanding. This is appropriate in the immediate aftermath. Survival first, understanding later. But the understanding must come, and the understanding requires a different neurochemical state than the survival state. The understanding requires the parasympathetic nervous system to activate. It requires the cortisol to clear. It requires the prefrontal cortex to come back online. And the mechanism by which the brain transitions from survival state to processing state, the mechanism by which the cortisol clears and the parasympathetic system activates, and the prefrontal cortex resumes its integrative function, is emotional expression. Crying, talking about the pain, feeling the feelings rather than suppressing them or pushing through them, or converting them into action before they've been fully experienced. This is crucial. Crying produces measurable physiological changes that facilitate recovery. Emotional tears, specifically the tears produced by grief, loss, and emotional overwhelm, contain stress hormones and other biochemical compounds that are literally being expelled from the body through the tear ducts. The act of crying reduces cortisol levels, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, and triggers the release of endorphins and oxytocin, both of which promote the sense of calm and connection that the recovery process requires. The person who is crying in the shower at 3 a.m. is not failing at recovery. They are performing recovery. Their body is doing precisely what it needs to do to process the loss and begin the neurochemical transition from survival to integration. The tears are the mechanism, and the culture that says, "Stop crying and get back up," is telling the person to interrupt the mechanism that would actually get them back up. The processing cycle. The crying in the middle doesn't happen once. It doesn't happen in a single cathartic session after which the grief is processed, and the person can move forward with the clean resolution the montage promises. The crying happens repeatedly, cyclically. The same loss is cried about multiple times. The same grief that seemed to have passed resurfaces after a period of relative calm. The same 3 a.m. session returns after a week where sleep was approaching something resembling normal. The same wave of emotion arrives when you thought the ocean had calmed. The repetition is disorienting. The repetition feels like failure. It feels like regression, like you're going backward into the pain rather than forward through it. And the culture, which expects recovery to be linear and ascending, confirms the interpretation. You're still crying about that. Haven't you moved past this yet? It's been 3 months. The culture is wrong. The repetition is not regression. It's depth. The brain processes significant loss in layers, not all at once. The processing operates like excavation. Each pass removes a layer and reveals the layer beneath it, and each layer requires its own emotional processing, its own tears, its own time. The first cycle processes the surface reality. The thing happened, the loss is real, the person is gone, Hijab is gone, the health is gone, the plan is gone. The tears that accompany this first cycle are the tears of shock and immediate grief, raw, unstructured, sometimes wordless. The body reacting to the reality before the mind has fully comprehended it. The second cycle, which may arrive days or weeks later, often after a period where the person thought they were doing better, processes a deeper layer. The implications of the loss. Not just that the person is gone, but what their absence means for the morning routine, for the holidays, for the inside jokes that no longer have an audience, for the future that was planned around their presence and must now be entirely reimagined. The tears that accompany this second cycle are different tears, more complex, less acute, more connected to meaning and absence than to shock and disbelief. The person in the second cycle often feels confused by the tears because the acute grief should be over, and this new wave doesn't feel like the first wave, and the difference is disorienting. But the difference is the depth. The processing has reached the implication layer, and the implications require their own grieving that is separate from and additional to the grieving of the surface reality. The third cycle, which may arrive weeks or months after the second, processes the identity layer. Who am I now that this has happened? Not just what is missing from my life, but who am I in the absence of what is missing? The person who defined themselves partly through the relationship that ended. The person whose professional identity was fused with the career that was lost. The person whose sense of self included the health that has deteriorated. The identity layer is the deepest layer, and the tears that accompany its processing can feel like regression, like the person is going backward to the beginning, because the intensity of the identity grief may match or exceed the intensity of the first cycle's tears despite months having passed. But the intensity isn't regression. It's the depth of what is being processed. The identity layer is more fundamental than the surface layer. It takes longer to reach. And it hurts differently, not with the sharp, acute pain of initial loss, but with the deep existential ache of realizing that the person you were before the fall no longer exists, and the person you're becoming hasn't fully formed. And the gap between those two identities is the loneliest place, a human being can stand. Most people miss this about why the repetitive nature of the crying is actually the most important indicator that the recovery is working rather than stalling. If the person were crying about the same aspect of the loss each time, with the same intensity and the same emotional quality and the same content, that would be stagnation. That would be the processing stuck on a loop, replaying without advancing, which is the clinical presentation of complicated grief that may benefit from professional support. But the person who is recovering, the person whose middle is working even when it doesn't feel like working, cries differently each time. The content shifts. The focus changes from what happened to what it means to who they are now. The quality of the grief evolves from acute to complex to existential. And the evolution, which is only visible to the person who is paying careful attention to the emotional landscape of their own recovery, rather than trying to escape it or suppress it or perform past it, is the evidence that the processing is doing exactly what processing does, moving through layers, integrating the loss into the identity, rebuilding the narrative that the fall shattered, constructing a new version of the self that includes the loss rather than being destroyed by it. One cry at a time. One layer at a time. One cycle at a time. On a timeline that belongs to the processing rather than to the social contract or the montage format or the well-meaning friend who thinks 3 months should be enough. Chapter 4. Why the timeline is a lie, the recovery nobody warns you about. The culture has a timeline for recovery and the timeline is wrong. The timeline says weeks for a job loss, months for a breakup, a year for a death, 2 years for a divorce. The timeline is presented as science when it's actually convention. A social agreement about how long suffering is acceptable before the suffering becomes inconvenient for the people who are not suffering and would like the suffering person to return to normal function, so that the relationship, the workplace, the family, the social group can resume operating without the disruption that the suffering person's middle is creating. The social pressure timeline. The timeline is enforced not through explicit communication, not through someone sitting you down and saying, "Your allotted grieving period has expired. Please resume normal function," but through the gradual, almost imperceptible withdrawal of the support that was abundantly available in the immediate aftermath of the fall. In the first days after the loss, the support is overwhelming. The calls come in constantly. The meals arrive at the door. The text messages fill the phone with love and concern and the specific quality of attention that humans provide when someone they care about is in acute crisis. The flowers arrive. The visits happen. The offers of help are genuine and specific and plentiful. "I'll pick up the kids." "I'm bringing dinner tonight. Call me anytime, I mean it." The people around the suffering person mobilize with the coordinated intensity that human communities produce when one of their members is visibly, acutely, undeniably in pain. The support feels overwhelming and genuine, and the suffering person, even in the depths of the fall, even through the fog of shock and the numbness of acute grief, registers that they are not alone, that the world has organized itself around their crisis, that people care. But the support has a half-life, and the half-life is shorter than the middle. The calls become less frequent after the first week. The meals stop arriving after the second. The text messages shift in tone and frequency. I'm here for you. Whatever you need becomes hope you're doing better after 2 weeks. Hope you're doing better becomes we should catch up soon after a month. We should catch up soon becomes silence after 2 months, not hostile silence, not the silence of abandonment or cruelty. The silence of lives that have resumed their normal cadence. The people who provided the acute support are not bad people. They're not withdrawing because they've stopped caring about the suffering person. They're withdrawing because their own lives have reasserted their own demands, because the acute crisis that mobilized them has passed from their daily awareness, even though it hasn't passed from the suffering person's daily experience. Because the chronic middle that replaced the acute fall doesn't trigger the same urgency response in the nervous system of the observer. Acute crises are visually dramatic, emotionally activating, and socially compelling. Chronic suffering is invisible, emotionally complex, and socially exhausting. The person in the middle discovers the half-life at the worst possible time. They discover it precisely when the real processing has begun. The acute shock of the first days and weeks, which was actually a form of psychological protection that buffered the full impact of the loss, has worn off. The numbness is lifting. The reality of the loss is landing, fully, for the first time. The weight that was held at a distance by the brain's shock response is now arriving at the body, at the emotional system, at the identity, with its full mass. And the support that was present when the shock was absorbing the impact, when the person was actually somewhat protected from the full force of the loss, has evaporated now that the shock has dissolved, and the person is fully exposed, and the full force is being felt for the first time. The support came when the buffer was active. The support left when the buffer dissolved. The timing is precisely backwards. This is crucial. The social pressure timeline creates a secondary suffering that compounds the primary loss. The person in the middle is now processing not just the original fall, but the loneliness of processing it without the support that was present at the beginning. They're processing the realization that the world moved on while they didn't, that the crisis that reorganized their entire life barely registered as a disruption in the lives of the people around them. That the support was genuine but temporary, and the temporariness of genuine support is its own kind of loss. A smaller loss, but a loss that arrives during the middle when the capacity to absorb additional loss is at its lowest point. And the person in the middle is managing the guilt of still struggling, the guilt of still being in the middle when the social contract, the unspoken agreement about how long recovery should take, says they should be approaching the rise. The guilt of needing more time than the timeline allows. The guilt of being a burden, or sensing that they might be a burden, or anticipating that continued need will transform them from someone who experienced something terrible into someone who is defined by having experienced something terrible. The transition from person who something happened to into person who can't move on is a transition the middle person is desperate to avoid. And the desperation to avoid it produces the performance. The performance of recovery. This is where the montage lie does its most concrete, most measurable, most therapeutically destructive damage. The person in the middle, having internalized the 3-beat format that says fall leads to pivot leads to rise, having registered the withdrawal of social support and the expiration The socially acceptable grieving period begins performing recovery, not experiencing it, performing it. The performance looks like recovery from the outside. It satisfies the social contract. It reassures the people around the suffering person that the crisis is resolving and normal function is returning. And it delays the actual recovery by weeks or months or years. They perform being better. They say, "I'm doing much better, thanks for asking," when they're doing slightly less terribly than they were 2 weeks ago, and slightly less terribly is the actual trajectory, but slightly less terribly doesn't satisfy the social contract and much better does. They perform having learned the lesson. They say, "I've really grown from this experience," when they're still in the middle of the experience and the growing is happening, but the growing hurts and the hurting is constant. And the presentation of growth is the package the social world accepts, while the reality of growth, which is messy and nonlinear and accompanied by the crying that nobody sees, is not the package anyone wants to receive. They perform the rise. They return to full social function before the system that supports social function has been restored. They attend the dinner. They make the small talk. They laugh at the jokes. And behind the performance in the car on the way home, the tears come because the performance consumed the last of the day's emotional reserves, and the reserves were already dangerously low. The performance of recovery is not recovery. It is the same performance architecture described in the earlier audiobooks about the quiet voice and the strong one, the same gap between the presented self and the actual self, now applied specifically to the experience of loss. The person is performing the rise while still in the middle. And the performance, because it consumes the emotional energy that should be going to the actual processing, because it prevents the crying and the feeling and the 3 a.m. sessions that are doing the genuine neurochemical work of integration, actually delays the real recovery. Every unit of energy spent performing recovery for the social audience is a unit of energy stolen from the actual recovery that is trying to happen in the spaces the performance won't allow. Most people miss this about why some people seem to recover quickly from devastating losses and then crash, sometimes catastrophically, months or years later. The quick recovery was the performance. The early return to function was the presentation. The "I've moved past it" was the script delivered to an audience that needed to hear it. And the crash that comes later, the depression that arrives 6 months after the loss that was supposedly processed, the anxiety that appears a year after the event that was supposedly integrated, the relationship collapse that occurs 2 years after the grief that was supposedly resolved, is the middle. The middle that was postponed rather than experienced. The processing that was delayed while the person performed recovery for the social world. The processing eventually demands to be completed because the brain does not abandon incomplete processing. It postpones it. It stores the unprocessed material in the body, in the nervous system, in the emotional architecture, where it sits, unresolved, exerting pressure, consuming background bandwidth, degrading the system's overall capacity until the moment when the stored material can no longer be contained and it surfaces. The grief that was postponed resurfaces, often triggered by a new loss that seems disproportionately devastating, because it's not just the new loss. It's the new loss plus the entire weight of the original loss that was never actually processed, because the performance consumed the time and the energy that the processing required. The montage wasn't just performed for the audience. It was performed for the self. And the self, eventually, with the patience of a biological system that cannot be permanently deceived, demands the truth. Chapter 5. Surviving the Middle. What to do when nobody is filming. The middle cannot be skipped. It cannot be hacked. It cannot be optimized. It cannot be compressed into a timeline that satisfies the social pressure or the montage format or the person's own desperate desire to be done with the pain and arrive at the rise. The middle takes what it takes. And what it takes is determined by the depth of the loss, the complexity of the identity reorganization the loss requires, and the degree to which the person allows the processing to proceed rather than performing recovery over the top of unprocessed pain. But the middle can be survived, not through the dramatic resilience the culture celebrates, through the unglamorous, unflattering, cinematically worthless practices that keep a person alive and functional and slowly recovering during the stretch of days and weeks and months where the only evidence that recovery is happening is the micro-recoveries that are too small to feel. Stop comparing your middle to other people's montages. The single most destructive behavior in the middle is the comparison between your unedited experience and someone else's edited presentation. This comparison is almost impossible to avoid because the edited presentations are everywhere. They're on your phone. They're in your feed. They're in the conversations with the friend who went through something similar and seems to have recovered in half the time, because the friend is performing recovery the way you might be performing recovery, presenting the rise while still in the middle, but you can't see their performance from the outside. You can only see the presentation, and the presentation looks like someone who fell and rose while you fell and stayed down. The person who posts the recovery story on social media posted the rise. They posted the lesson. They posted the transformation photo. They didn't post the 3 a.m. ceiling sessions. They didn't post the week they spent in bed with the curtains drawn. They didn't post the 4 a.m. panic attack where the future looked like a dark hallway with no doors. They didn't post the crying in the shower, or the inability to eat, or the moment they screamed into a pillow, because the pillow was the only thing that would absorb the sound without producing consequences. They didn't post the calls they didn't answer, or the lies they told about how they were doing, or the night they sat in the car in the driveway for 20 minutes, because they needed the 20 minutes between the outside world and the inside of the house to reassemble the face that the day had dismantled. You're seeing their highlight reel and comparing it to your raw footage. The comparison is not just unfair. It's structurally impossible to produce an accurate result because the two data sets are incomparable. One is the complete, unedited, moment-by-moment experience of being a person in the middle. The other is a curated selection of the moments that survived the editorial process and made it to the public presentation. Comparing them produces the conclusion that you're failing and they succeeded, and the conclusion is wrong, completely wrong, based on data that was specifically designed to produce exactly that wrong conclusion. Stop consuming the comparisons, Or if you can't stop consuming them because the algorithm and the habit are too strong, at least label them correctly. This is their edit. My experience is unedited. The two cannot be compared. Let the crying happen. This is the hardest practice because every cultural message you've received since childhood, every resilience narrative you've internalized, every well-meaning friend who says, you need to be strong, every internal voice that says tears are weakness, is telling you to stop the very mechanism that is actually doing the work. Let the tears come. In the shower where the water covers the sound. In the car where the sealed windows create the only private space available. At 3 a.m. with the ceiling as your only witness and the dark as your only audience. Let them come without the shame that the culture attaches to them, and without the timeline that the social world imposes on them, and without the self-judgment that says you should be past this by now. The tears are doing work, neurochemical work, processing work, integration work. Each session of crying is the brain completing another cycle of the layered processing described in Chapter 3. The tears are not evidence that you're broken. They're evidence that you're repairing. And the repair, like all biological repair, like the knitting of a bone or the healing of a wound or the restoration of tissue after surgery, cannot be rushed without compromising the quality of the result. The bone that is forced to bear weight before it has healed breaks again. The wound that is forced open before it has closed reopens worse. The emotional processing that is interrupted before it has completed stores the incomplete processing in the body, where it will demand completion later under worse conditions. Let the repair proceed at its own pace. The tears know what they're doing even when you don't. Track the micro-recoveries. Since the daily experience of the middle is indistinguishable from stagnation, because the unit of progress is too small to detect in real time, since each day feels identical to the day before, and the accumulated improvement is invisible from inside the accumulation, create the mechanism for detection that the middle doesn't naturally provide. Write down one thing each day that was slightly different from the same day the previous week. Not better. Not a triumph. Not an achievement the montage would film. Different. You cooked a meal instead of eating cereal. You returned a phone call you'd been avoiding. You went outside and walked to the end of the block and came back. You worked an hour before the focus dissolved. You laughed at something that surprised you. The items will seem insignificant in isolation. They are insignificant in isolation. No single micro-recovery is worth noting. But accumulated across weeks, the list becomes something the daily experience could not provide. Visible evidence that the middle is moving, that the micro-recoveries are accumulating, that the trend line, invisible from inside any single day, is bending upward when viewed from the scale of weeks. That the rise, completely invisible from the inside, is already underway, and has been underway for longer than you thought. Tell one person the truth about where you are, not the performance, not the I'm doing better, the truth. I'm still in the middle, I'm still struggling. The timeline the world gave me has expired and I'm not done, and I need someone to know that I'm not done without telling me I should be. One person, spoken honestly, without managing their response. The practice from the earlier audiobook about the strong one applies here with equal force. The honest sentence opens the door that the performance keeps closed. And the door, opened even slightly, lets in the air that the middle needs to breathe. Resist the performance of recovery. When the social world asks how you're doing and the honest answer is still in the middle, you have a choice. You can perform the rise, or you can tell the truth. The performance is easier in the moment and more damaging in the long term because every performance delays the processing and every delay extends the middle. The truth is harder in the moment and more healing in the long term because every honest expression of where you actually are is itself a micro-recovery. An act of integration. A refusal to allow the montage format to dictate the pace of your actual, real human recovery. The truth might make someone uncomfortable. The truth might exceed the timeline they've allotted for your suffering. Let it exceed. Your recovery doesn't answer to their schedule. Closing thoughts, the part they don't film. They don't film the middle because the middle isn't entertaining. The middle doesn't resolve. The middle doesn't build to a climax or deliver a twist or produce the emotional payoff that the audience expects and the format demands. The middle is a person lying in bed at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday knowing they should get up and not being able to get up, and the not being able doesn't look like anything from the outside. It just looks like a person in bed. It doesn't look like the dramatic collapse of the fall. It doesn't look like the triumphant return of the rise. It looks like nothing. And nothing doesn't get filmed. Nothing doesn't get posted. Nothing doesn't make the montage. But the nothing is everything. The nothing is where the rebuilding happens. In the silence between the dramatic beats, in the tears that nobody sees and that nobody posts and that nobody puts in the TED Talk, in the 3 a.m. ceiling sessions where the person stares at the darkness and the darkness doesn't answer and the not answering is, somehow, part of the processing. In the micro-recoveries that are too small to celebrate, too mundane to notice, too boring to describe, but that are, collectively, molecule by molecule, the entire mechanism by which a human being reconstitutes themselves after being shattered. The montage lied to you, not about the fall. The fall was real. Falls happen. The world breaks things and people are among the things the world breaks. Not about the rise. The rise is real and it's coming and it will come for you the way it comes for everyone who allows the middle to do its work rather than performing past it or suppressing through it or comparing it to someone else's edited version and concluding that the middle is a personal failure rather than a universal phase. The montage lied about the middle. It told you the middle didn't exist. That the fall leads directly to the lesson and the lesson leads directly to the transformation, and the transformation happens in a moment, a scene, a pivot where the music changes and the lighting shifts and the broken person becomes the rebuilt person in a single cinematic beat. It told you that recovery is an event, something that happens to you, something that arrives. Recovery is not an event. Recovery is not a moment. Recovery is a season, a long, gray, unglamorous season that produces no content and generates no applause and receives no audience because seasons don't have audiences. Seasons have weather, and the weather of the middle is rain. And the rain, however relentless, however gray, however tedious and repetitive and apparently endless, is what makes things grow. You're in the middle right now. Or you've been in the middle and you recognize the terrain, and the description is landing in the place where the memory of the middle still lives. Or you will be in the middle because life. guarantees the fall, and the fall guarantees the middle. And the middle is the price of being human enough to have built something worth losing, loved someone worth grieving, invested in something worth mourning when it breaks. The crying is not the problem. The crying is the solution. The tears are doing the work that the montage replaced with a music cue. The stagnation is not permanent. The stagnation is progress too small to feel. The micro-recoveries are accumulating beneath the threshold of detection, and the rise is already underway, and you can't see it because you're inside it. The timeline the world gave you was wrong. Your middle takes what your middle takes. The social contract's deadline has nothing to do with the brain's processing timeline. Let the brain finish. The brain knows what it's doing. And the rise, when it comes, won't come with music. It won't come with a camera or a crowd or the dramatic pivot that the montage has been promising since the first time you saw a movie where someone fell and got back up, and the getting back up looked like something that happened all at once instead of something that happened one micro-recovery at a time across months of invisible accumulation. The rise will come quietly, on a Tuesday, on a morning that feels like every other morning in the middle. You'll wake up and the first thought will be about the coffee and not about the fall. And the coffee thought, so ordinary that it wouldn't survive the editorial process that produces montages, will be the signal, not the trumpet, not the orchestra, the signal. Quiet and ordinary and profoundly, devastatingly beautiful in its ordinariness. The middle is behind you. The rise happened while you were busy surviving it. You rebuilt yourself one micro-recovery at a time in the space between the fall and the morning, where the coffee was the first thought. Nobody filmed it. Nobody needed to. You were there, that was enough.